So good afternoon. I'm Jordan Budd. I'm interim dean here at UNH School of Law, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our law school and to the Warren B. Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Policy. We're very honored today to welcome Senators Gregg and Senators Bayh to our law school to discuss the challenges raised by the federal budget deficit, and in particular, the urgent need to engage our nation's leaders and, most particularly, our aspiring national leaders in a conversation about its implications. It's especially fitting that the conversation take place here today at the Rudman Center. As some of you may know, the Rudman Center takes as its mission honoring the legacy of Warren B. Rudman, one of our state's greatest public servants, by training the next generation of public policy leaders. And as all of us certainly know, Senator Rudman took as one of his defining commitments fiscal responsibility, and in particular the need to assure that our public policy leaders, such as those who are being trained here at the Rudman Center, are prepared to make the hard choices required for our nation to live within its means. So it is a special and particular honor for the center to welcome Senators Gregg and Bayh here to speak with us today. I'd like to now introduce our moderator, Bob Bixby, Executive Director of the Concord Coalition and a great friend and supporter of the law school and the Rudman Center. Bob.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. And the Concord Coalition always says there's no such thing as a free lunch, but today we're wrong. I'm Bob Bixby. I'm head of the Concord Coalition, and which was, of course, co-founded by Warren Rudman and Paul Tsongas in 1992. And this year, we're proud to be joined with another organization, the Campaign to Fix the Debt, which Judd Gregg is co-chair of. And the two organizations have come together to form a project called the First Budget Initiative. And the First Budget Initiative is designed to try to get voters in the two key early states, Iowa and New Hampshire, to focus on the tough choices that presidential candidates are going to have to face once they take office, if they're lucky enough to be elected and have to present a first budget to the Congress. First budgets are often quite consequential of a new administration. If you think of the Reagan budget or the Bush budget or the Clinton budget, the Obama budget, often the first budget of a president sets the tone for the next several years. So our premise and our purpose today is to help tee up this issue in a very key location, is to say to the presidential candidates, it doesn't really matter whether you're coming at this from the left or right, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. The budget is on an unsustainable track. That's pretty much a consensus position. And so as the next president, you're going to have to, with your first budget, present a set of policies that are going to have to deal with this and account for the pre-existing debt and what we do about it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be your only priority or your top priority, but it certainly has to be among your priorities. One thing we like to tell people is that if you're a candidate for president, the debt is your running mate. It's going to be there when you take the oath of office. It's going to be there when you have your first cabinet meeting. And so it's good now during the campaign to give voters a sense of how you would address those issues. Now, I also want to thank Fiduciary Trust and the Peter G. Peterson Foundation for generous support for the program today. And I'd like to also thank the Business and Industry Association of New Hampshire for co-sponsoring this event with the Concord Coalition, Fix the Debt, First Budget Initiative, and of course the Rudman Center. We have two very distinguished speakers today who know a lot about these issues. They've grappled with it both from the position of being a United States Senator and maybe even more importantly by being governors of their respective states. Governors also know the imperative of making tough choices on the budget. It's a tradition here at the Rudman Center to have students introduce the guest speakers, and we are going to do that now. Alexander Sosnowski is going to introduce Governor Senator Gregg, and Elizabeth Velez is going to introduce Governor Senator Bayh. So let me have our presenters come up and do that. And then we will go right to the statements, but I forgot to mention that the way this is going to work is we're going to have the opening statements, and then we're going to have questions from the audience, and we have on those note cards that have been passed around. And so if you're thinking of questions, you can write them down. I already have a couple. Linda and Deli will be collecting them, and Chase Hagman, who's up there, will be collecting them. Chase, by the way, is our New England Regional Coordinator, and he is also a graduate of this school and a member of the New Hampshire Bar. So, okay, now for the presenters.
Hello, I am Alexander Sosnowski, a first-year student here at the University of New Hampshire School of Law. It is my great pleasure to introduce Senator Judd Gregg, a fellow New Hampshireite. I believe that's what we're called. He attended Columbia University and then went on to receive his JD in 1972 from Boston University School of Law and an LLM in tax law in 1975. He served as a U.S. representative from New Hampshire from 1981 to 1989, and then governor of New Hampshire from 1989 to 1993. After that, he preceded Warren Rudman himself and went to the United States Senate from 1993 to 2011 and was chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. Senator Gregg served on the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, and he is a national leader on fiscal policy, a well-known budget expert, and a respected voice on healthcare, economic, and financial regulatory issues. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Velez, and I'm a first-year student here at UNH School of Law, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Senator Bayh. He really embodies Rudman's commitment to leadership and public policy, and it's a pleasure to have him here today. Senator Bayh received a BA in business at Indiana and followed this with a JD at the University of Virginia Law School. He then followed his father's commitment to public service when he was elected governor of Indiana from 1989 to 1997, where he championed fiscal responsibility and he balanced large tax cuts with a budget surplus, something I'm sure many of us would like to learn from. He was then elected senator from 1997 to 2011, where he continued to embody a commitment to bipartisanship and fiscal restraint and served on several important committees, including armed services, banking, housing and urban affairs, energy, and small business. Since leaving the Senate, he's continued his commitment to public service and serves on the board of several organizations, including the Concord Coalition, one of the two organizations that's here today to tell us more about First Budget. So please join me in welcoming Senator Bayh.
That's what I was told.
It's usually the microphones you can't see that get you in trouble.
Can we not wrap that around the chair? Thanks.
My back.
Complicated.
Okay, are we mic'd up and ready to go? I don't even know if my microphone's on, but I'll just talk loud. So. Okay, and I won't talk that loud. Senator Gregg, you want to start us off?
Well, thank you, Bob. First, it's a great pleasure to be here at the Rudman Center. It's a tremendous honor to be able to succeed Warren Rudman in the Senate. He exceptional role model and did a great deal for the state of New Hampshire, and we were good friends, our family, and he and I went back to when we were kids growing up in Nashua. So it's always a pleasure to do things that recognize Warren Rudman's commitment to New Hampshire. It's also a tremendous pleasure to be here with Evan Bayh, who was one of the strongest and most effective members of the Senate that I dealt with during my term in the Senate. Nice guy, and his wife's even nicer. And he and Susan and Kathy and I got to be really good friends and put together many good ideas while we served in the Senate to make government work. You know, you hear a lot about how there's so much partisanship and how everybody's always tugging and pulling and nobody gets along. That's not true, quite honestly, or wasn't true during my time there. And one of the great examples of it was the ability to always work with Evan across the aisle on complex issues. And maybe it was because we were both governors, but we were there to govern and get things done. We weren't there to shout, and as a result, we were able to do some good things together. And so it's nice to join with him on this initiative and a number of other things which we worked together on in order to try to get people to govern and address core issues which affect our nation. And this initiative, the first budget, is very unique and very special and very New Hampshire-centric because it basically has as its goal what we here in New Hampshire do naturally, which is to talk to people who want to lead us in the nation, specifically people who are running for president, and ask them how and what they're going to do to deal with a fundamental problem which our nation faces. That fundamental problem is the issue of our deficit and our debt. And it can't be overestimated how important this issue is. I recognize that it's not on the front page of the paper all the time these days. Other things are taking precedent because of the moment. But if you want to look at the core issues which the next president is going to have to deal with, which are going to affect the capacity of our nation to be a strong and vibrant place for our children to live and grow, the debt and our deficits are right at the top of the list. Let me try to put it in context, and then I'll let Evan talk and do the substance. I'll do the color, and he does the substance. Basically, historically, our debt has been about 35% of GDP. That was true up until about 2008, since World War II. That was a very strong position as a nation, 35% of GDP. The benchmark for getting in trouble on deficit to debt, it's about 60% of GDP. When your debt gets to 60% of GDP, you're a nation in trouble. Well, today our debt is about 74% of GDP, and it's going up. We've doubled our debt in the last 6 years. We will have tripled it by the time we get to 2020. To try to put this in context, if you take the countries in the world that have the worst debt to GDP ratio, the number one country is Japan. But Japan has a unique situation. Because they're such a great saving nation, they don't have to borrow from other countries in order to fund their nation. They borrow internally from their own people. Very unique situation. The second nation with the worst debt to GDP ratio is Greece. We know what's happened in Greece. They've gone bankrupt. Third nation, Iceland. If you followed what happened in Iceland during the banking crisis, you know it has also gone bankrupt. Fourth nation, Ireland. Also went bankrupt within the last 5 years. Fifth nation, Italy. Nobody knows what's happening in Italy because nobody knows how they keep their books. But we're pretty sure they're bankrupt. Sixth nation is Belgium, which I hope there's nobody here from Belgium, but really it's not big enough to worry about on this context. Sixth nation, the United States of America. Our debt to GDP ratio puts us in a class of countries which are all experiencing catastrophic economic disruption because they've gotten their debt so high. And our debt is going up. Why haven't we had that experience? Because the world looks at us and expects America to step up and solve its problems, which we always do and which we historically have. But we still have this problem, and we haven't solved it. As Erskine Bowles said, who was the co-chairman with Alan Simpson of the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which I had the good fortune to serve on, he made the point, the United States, he refers to the United States as the best horse in the glue factory. We essentially have a problem which is putting us on a course to some sort of significant economic disruption within the foreseeable future. It's not over the horizon, it's within the foreseeable future. Because it's someday, somebody in the world is going to wake up, probably in China, but maybe in some other nation that holds our debt, and they're going to say to themselves, you know, with this debt to GDP ratio that they have in the United States, with their growing deficits and their growing debt, they're not going to be able to pay us back in the same dollars that we purchased when we borrowed from them. They're going to have to inflate their economy, or they're going to have to do something else which undermines the debt which we're taking on. And so they're going to decide, that person who wakes up in China, that they're either, one, not going to lend to us anymore, or two, they're going to charge us a heck of a lot more. And at that point, you hit the spiral that Greece and Italy and Ireland and Iceland and France and these other nations have hit, where essentially you move into an economic chaos where you can't catch your tail because your debt has been increasing so fast that you can't pay it off at a rate that gives people the confidence that they're going to get back the same value that they lent to you. And that creates massive economic disruption. And in the end, what it creates is a reduction in the standard of living for the nation that does that to itself. A reduction in the standard of living for our children, which is really totally inappropriate and unsustainable. This problem is solvable. Very, very solvable. There have been a number of initiatives to try to solve this. Simpson-Bowles, I would recommend, or suggest, is probably got the furthest down the road, did the most constructive work in this area. But there have been other initiatives. The question which we need to ask as citizens of New Hampshire, of whoever the next president is going to be, and whoever the next president is going to be, by the way, will be in New Hampshire a lot. And you'll all get to meet he or she and talk with them one-on-one if you wish to. The question which we have to ask the next president is, do you, number one, recognize this as a very critical problem for your presidency, managing the deficit and the debt? And number two, will you put together a budget as your first budget which recognizes that problem and starts to address it? And number three, and this is what Evan and I want to enforce and bring to the table, will this be a bipartisan solution? Because the big drivers of our deficit and debt today are entitlement spending and our tax laws, which are complex and totally inefficient. And you can't fix either one of those issues, any of the entitlement issues or the tax issues, tax revenue problem, unless you do it in a bipartisan way. So we've come together, Evan and I, along with the Concord Coalition, which we're great fans of, and which I am also a participant in, and the Fix the Debt group, which I co-chair, to try to get this message out and get New Hampshire citizenry activated on the issue of asking our next president, whoever he or she may be, as they come to New Hampshire, will you, as part of your first budget, face up to the deficit and debt situation so that our children can be assured of getting a strong and vibrant nation? Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, who is much more eloquent and is an extraordinary individual in the area of leading public policy in a lot of different areas, but especially in the area of fiscal policy. Evan.
Well, thank you very much, Judd, and it's a pleasure to be here today, everyone, with all of you. And Elizabeth, I'd like to start by thanking you for that moving eulogy that you provided for me. And Judd kind of followed along in a similar vein, and you know, I'm always surprised when I'm introduced pretty much the way I wrote it. So I'm grateful to you for sticking to the script and saying all those very, very nice things. And I would like to echo what Judd had to say. He and Kathy are just extraordinary assets for your state, and he's someone I not only have a great deal of respect for, but in fact a great deal of affection for. And it's because he really loves your state and he loves our country. And he's a problem solver, not an ideologue, and he's a member of a political party, but he cares about our country first. And that's why I've always admired Judd and his public service, and I'm just pleased to be with him once again here today. I'm going to try and be non-senatorial. You know, normally in the Senate, you know, members only, you know, after about half an hour cleared his throat, and we won't do that to you today. We're going to have a nice dialogue going, which I think is really the most important part. So let me just mention a few brief things. I'm here today because you're the most important people in America. You and people like you in Iowa. Because you're going to have more to say about who the next president of the United States is than anybody else. And I actually think that's a good thing. There was a period in my life when I had gone off my medication and I was spending a lot of time in your state thinking about running for president. And I used to get asked the question, or when I'd go other places in California or New York or places, well, what about this crazy system that we have where you get these two comparatively small states, Iowa and New Hampshire, and just a few people get to decide, they get a disproportionate influence on the electoral process. Shouldn't this be changed? Isn't this unfair? And I used to always say, having participated in that for a while, I said, no, I don't think I'd change it. And I'll tell you why. It's important that we keep in our process someplace early on where the candidates have to come and see you face to face and sit in auditoriums like this or in your homes or in coffee shops or in businesses, and you can size them up person to person. It's just not all about mass marketing and 30-second commercials and all that kind of thing. And although you're from the Northeast and I'm from the Midwest, I think our people share one thing in common, and that is we can spot a phony from a mile off. And so, ask the hard questions. And of course, there's going to be some politics in the answer, but you'll get a pretty good idea about who's got what it takes to lead this country. And what we're asking you to do is that among the other things that you ask them about our budget and our deficit and our debt, because as Judd mentioned, it's going to have a huge impact on everything else. We're at a period here where for the next year or two, it's kind of okay. It's not good, but it's not awful. But it pretty quickly starts turning up after that. And at the end of the next decade, think about this. The interest that we will spend, just the interest, not paying down the debt, but just the interest we will spend on the debt we've already run up, will exceed more than everything else we spend today, and all discretionary spending. Everything. So if you're a progressive Democrat and you care about education, there won't be any funding for education. If you care about health care, no money for that. The environment, where's the money going to come from? Infrastructure improvements for roads and bridges and airports, nothing for that. If you're a member of the Republican Party or a conservative, Democrats care about national security too, but Republicans right now, I think correctly, are observing that if we keep going down this path, in a dangerous world, the defense budget is going to be eviscerated to a point where it's really going to affect our national security. There's no money for that. It's all going to pay interest on the debt. And if you care about a growing economy, eventually this is going to force interest rates to be even higher than they are, which will mean less investment, less growth, fewer jobs, and ultimately a lower standard of living. That's what it's all about. And we believe that we should ask our next president about this. As Judd said, do you think this is important? Are you willing to make it a priority? And in your first 100 days, are you willing to work with members of the other party to try and put us on a more sustainable path? I don't think we can expect them to give us, in long, gory detail, all the hard decisions that they're going to have to make. And they're nothing but hard decisions when you walk into the Oval Office. All the easy things get done beforehand. But I do think we can expect from them at least some understanding that they're going to try and grapple in an honest way with this challenge. And so I'll end up by saying this. I think really what we're talking about here today is what does it mean to be an American? And by that I mean, when you look at the history of our country, people came to this nation and still do largely in search of freedom in all of its manifestations. Political freedom, religious freedom, the freedom to speak your mind, to associate those with your own choosing, and the freedom to enjoy the fruits of your own labor and through hard work and diligence and innovation and savings and everything else, getting ahead for yourself and your loved ones, having a little bit better standard of living than maybe your parents did. And you want to pass that on to your kids too. Historically, Americans have not just lived for themselves. We've not just lived in the moment and said, well, forget about the future, the kids and the grandkids, they can fend for themselves. That's not what we've been like. We've paid it back, but we've also paid it forward. And we've been willing to make some of those hard choices to make sure every generation of Americans, everyone until now, has handed down to their children an America that's a little more prosperous, a little more decent, a little more just. The question is, what will we do? Will we break that chain? Or will we do what it takes to make sure that our kids can have the same opportunity we did? That's really what this is all about. not burdening them with trillions of dollars of debt. What is it, about $200,000 per American now? I mean, think about that. That's the legacy that we're leaving our children. My own belief is that that is profoundly immoral, and I also think it is profoundly un-American. So that's the challenge, but the good news is it doesn't have to be that way. It's up to us. We can do something about it, and our elected representatives can do something about it. We have in the past, we can once again, and it's all going to start right here in New Hampshire with people just like you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we have our question collectors, and while we're collecting questions, let me pick up on Senator Bayh's last point and ask a little bit about what would be required for for a solution, or what elements should go into that first budget. Senator Gregg, when you served on the Bowles-Simpson Commission, there were actually a lot of trade-offs that were made that went into that. You had a very liberal senator like Dick Durbin and a very conservative senator like Tom Coburn eventually sign off on it. And any effort like this involves, it seems to me, some very hard choices politically, some things that members would not want to go back to their own parties to face the voters on. What were some, if you could let us in on some of the deliberations, what were some of the trade-offs and how that got started and concluded?
Well, first off, for those of you who don't remember Simpson Bowles, because it was a while ago, this was a commission that was set up, appointed by the president. It came out of a bill that I sponsored with Kent Conrad that came very close to passing in the Senate but failed by a few votes, which basically said, do a global deal, do a grand bargain where you basically fix the deficit and the debt for as far as the eye can see. At the time that the commission was convened, Erskine, Bowles, Dow, and Simpson told the members of the commission, there were 16 members, 6 from the Senate, 6 from the House, there were 18 members, 6 from the administration, told the members, and we agreed to this, that we're not going to think small ball, we're going to think big ball. We're going to try to do the global settlement. And at that time, which was 4 years ago, it was agreed that to fix the deficit, you needed to reduce the deficit, fix the debt, to hold it at about 70% of GDP, not to get it down to the 35% where we had been, or the 60%, which was more reasonable, but to just hold it at 70% of GDP. We had to take $4 trillion out of the deficit over a 10-year period. And the second agreement which was reached was that there was an agreement that the majority of the problem was on the spending side, but there was also a revenue issue. So we agreed that 3/4 of the $4 trillion would come from spending restraint, and 1/4 would come from new revenues. We did not get into the entitlement programs, the health care entitlement programs, because we'd just been through Obamacare, and the sensitivity of the issue was so great that the decision was made not to reopen that issue. However, it did come up with a proposal, the commission, which was bipartisan, which was supported by the 3 most fiscally conservative members of the Senate that Mitch McConnell could think of to put on the commission, myself, Mike Crapo, and Tom Coburn, and by 2 very liberal members of the Senate, who were Dick Durbin and Kent Conrad, although Kent might be defined as, he'd be upset if I called him liberal, but you know, from my perspective, he was a liberal. Anyway, and so it was bipartisan. It was shown to be a bipartisan document where you could get agreement. Let's take the tax part of it, because that was where the biggest step forward was taken that still needs to be done. The commission produced very strict spending restraint on discretionary spending, and that was put in place by the Congress and the President, and in fact, discretionary spending has essentially, which is 30% of the federal budget, has essentially been held flat now for 5 years, and has saved, how much, $2 trillion, $2.5 trillion? $2.5 trillion has been reduced in spending out of the baseline by that decision. The 2 things that weren't addressed or have not yet been addressed is entitlement reform and tax reform. In the area of tax reform, you asked how this was done. Well, basically, the agreement was we'd step on everybody's toes. That's how you do tax reform. Everybody's toes has to be stepped on. And what we essentially did was radically reduce the number of deductions and exemptions and take the revenue from that and use it to reduce rates dramatically. So the rates under Simpson-Bowles ended up being 10, 15, and 23%, I think were the numbers, top rate being 23%. But essentially, there were no deductions and exemptions left of any size. And then after we reduced rates, we took a small percentage of the savings from deductions and exemptions that had been eliminated and used it to reduce debt to get over 10 years about $100 billion a year of revenue to reduce debt. That template is still very viable today, and is in fact being talked about by senior policy people in Washington, like Ron Wyden, who's the ranking Democrat on finance, and Orrin Hatch, who's the chairman of finance, and Paul Ryan, the chairman of Ways and Means. So that template of dramatically reducing deductions and exemptions, using the money to first reduce rates and secondly to reduce the deficit, is a very viable template. But it does require, and you asked about trade-offs, it does require that everybody's toes get stepped on. Because if you protect any interest group in the exercise of reducing deductions and exemptions, then all the other interest groups have a right to claim that they should be protected. So if you protect the home mortgage interest and you don't do anything on that, then obviously the health care deduction says that people who support that, or the state and local property tax, or charitable deduction. So everybody has to be affected the same way.
Senator Bayh.
Well, I think Judd outlined it pretty well, very well. The only thing I would add to that is, and I would recommend this for your thought, at some point in our country, we got away from the notion of compromise. Back in my father's day, he had the privilege of being in the Senate for 18 years. And throughout our history, usually the notion of principled compromise was viewed as an act of statesmanship. We wouldn't have a country if the founders we'd have 13 independent countries. And in fact, we did under the Articles of Confederation, and they realized that wouldn't work, and so we got our current Constitution. But go back and read the constitutional debates. There were a lot of differences, heated differences, or dramatic differences. And if they hadn't been able to reconcile those differences and find some kind of consensus, we would not have a United States of America. And so somewhere along the line, we went away from the notion of principled compromise being viewed as an act of statesmanship. Yes, that's what we want. We want people to sit down, and they're not going to agree on everything. That's not the way the world works. But at least they ought to be able to agree on some things, and if they can't get it all done, well, at least get as much done as you can and come back later and work on the rest. Some way we got away from that, and instead now compromise is viewed by too many of our fellow citizens as an act of betrayal. How can you work with those people? How can you even talk to those people? Shouldn't it be 100% or nothing, my way or the highway? Well, if you take 100% or nothing, take an all or nothing point of view, nothing is what you're going to end up with the vast majority of the time. Now that works if you're living if you're on a sustainable path. The problem we got when it comes to the debt and deficit is that we're on an unsustainable path. Every year we don't do anything. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the decisions you have to ultimately have to make when the crisis hits are more painful than they otherwise would have to be. And our children and grandchildren get left to pick up the pieces. And so Judd was exactly right. To make some of those choices, like the commission he was on, and people checking their partisanship and their ideology at the door, and instead saying, okay, how are we going to get this done? We got to view it again as an act of statesmanship and not so much as an act of betrayal. That's what we really need to look for in our leaders.
Yeah, just as a corollary to that, because Evan is absolutely right. You know, there are too many people today who, in governing, especially in Washington, stand in the corner and shout. You can't govern if you stand in the corner and shout. You simply have to be willing to go across the aisle without giving up your principles and reach agreements which create governance. Big issues in our nation, big issues, which affect a lot of people, like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, tax reform. The American people will reject any proposal in these areas which is not deemed to be fair. And fair, the definition and the definability of fairness under our culture is bipartisan. It's that simple. if a partisan decision is put forward in any of those areas, it will be deemed to be unfair by those people on the other side of the aisle. And so Evan's absolutely right. You've got to get back to governing as being a respectable activity in our system.
Bob, can I mention one last thing? Then let's get to some questions. One other thing we're doing here, as Judd mentioned, we've kind of levered up the national balance sheet. We've gone from 30 or 35% the size of our debt to the size of our economy, up to 70%, even a little bit higher here a few years ago. And what that means is that the next time a crisis comes along, the next time the economy turns down, we've really tied our hands in terms of responding to that. Most mainstream economists would say that when the economy turns down, you've got a drop off in what they call aggregate demand. People aren't spending, people aren't investing. The level of economic activity goes down. And whether you believe that tax cuts should be the response to kind of get that back up, to fill in the gap of aggregate demand, or whether you believe that stimulus spending on infrastructure, things like that should be the way, or maybe some of both, you can't do either. And so we've really tied the hands of our policymakers in terms of how they respond to a future economic downturn. And the one thing we know for certain is, at some point, we're going to have one.
Well, we have a number of questions, so I'm going to try to consolidate some. Some are substantive and some are on politics. So let me ask a kind of a political question. There's one observation that we're focusing here on the presidential candidates and sort of an implication, does that leave Congress off the hook? I mean, what is the respective role of the president versus Congress in leading on this issue? And another one is related to that, is whether there are any particular changes in the budget process that might help Congress get through some of these more difficult choices.
You want to talk about the process part of it, Judd, since you were head of the budget committee? With regard to the presidency, well, look, they're co-equal branches of government, so they're both responsible. But from my experience, particularly as governor, getting the Indiana General Assembly to do anything was hard. And the only way it was going to happen would be if I went out there publicly and said, in every, I don't know if in New Hampshire it's the same way, but in our state, the middle of January, I would give a State of the State address as governor. And then about a week later, I'd submit my budget in great detail. And we had to choose how much money was coming in, how much was going out, and how are we going to allocate it, line after line after line. And I had to make hard choices. I would never get the legislature to make hard choices if I didn't stand up and say, here's my take on it, follow me. If you don't want to follow me, make changes of your own and we'll work through it, but at least staking out some ground. And so you usually have to count on the chief executive to take that first step and then work with the legislature to try and improve, amend, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think whoever the next president is going to be, there will be, God willing, a season for governing, where we'll go through an election, the air will be kind of clear, and enough people will say for the next 6, 9, 12 months, okay, let's see what we can get done here. And if the chief executive is willing to call them in and sit them down and say, here's my take at things, let's try and get this done, I think we got a shot at it. So both are responsible, but I do think you got to count on the president to make the first step.
I agree 100% with that. Leadership drives policy, and the president is the leader of the country. On process, changing the budget process, actually process doesn't drive what has to be done here. Budget is important because it sets the blueprint, it sets the tone, it sets the direction, but in the end, it is the president taking the leadership, and are there members of Congress who are courageous enough to step up and follow? We've got some pretty good examples historically of how this can work. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill did Social Security. Ronald Reagan and Dan Rostenkowski did tax reform. Just recently, President Bush and Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and Chris Dodd did the banking reform, did basically TARP, which in my opinion allowed us to avoid a fiscal meltdown, which would have been cataclysmic as compared with one which was dramatic. So there are opportunities But in the end, it's not the process that drives it, it's the leadership that drives it.
Okay, I think now I'm going to consolidate some questions and grab hold of the third rail. Or at least I'm not going to, but the senators. I'm going to invite the senators. We have a number of questions about Social Security, but they come at it from different points of view, and appropriately, as my baby boomer eyes are failing me here, I'll put on my glasses as we have. One of them says, my first grandchild will be born this summer. Give me some reasons to feel optimistic that her American life will be as good as better than mine. Another says, how do you answer the charge that your campaign uses fear-mongering to convince us that our country will be destroyed if we don't cut Social Security and Medicare? And then there's another question or two that refer to earned benefits versus unearned benefits in the budget, and do we make a distinction between that? And then another about would we describe not just the national debt, but the true unfunded liabilities of the social insurance program? So there are a range of issues there, dealing mostly with the future of Social Security. It could be applied to health care as well, but this is more of a defined system.
I don't see the two. I don't see the health care accounts, the entitlement accounts in health care and Social Security, as having the same solution. You know, the fear-mongering issue. It's not fear-mongering to point out facts. The simple fact is that the Social Security fund runs out of money. There is no money in it to begin with, by the way. It's a cash-in, cash-out basis, and you get a note from the federal government that says it'll pay off. What's the note mean? It means our kids have to pay the interest on the note plus the note in order to pay the Social Security benefits of our generation. Social Security's problems are driven almost entirely by the demographic situation which we're confronting, which Evan mentioned. We're going from 35 million retired people to 70 million retired people. The baby boom generation will be fully retired by 2017, technically fully retired, although many people are going to have to continue working. And the system is not structured to support that. There were, in 1950, 16 people paying into Social Security for every one person taking out. Today, there are 2.5 people paying in for every one person taking out. By year 2025, there'll be 2 people paying in for every one person taking out. Doesn't work. Simply doesn't work. It's not fear-mongering to be accurate. How do you fix it? Well, if you fix it now, it'll have virtually no impact on present recipients in a way that they'll even notice. In fact, Simpson-Bowles put forward a Social Security fix, and Simpson-Bowles did it in a unique way. We decided that we did not want it as part of settling the deficit debt issue. We used it completely separate from settling the deficit debt issue. We thought we should make Social Security solvent for the next 75 years. What were the changes we made? We changed the age of retirement by 2 years, but we took 60 years to do it. So nobody over the age of 15 was impacted by this change. Nobody. And yet, some of the more activist interest groups who drive big cars in Washington and have nice salaries and go to fancy restaurants immediately sent out a fundraising letter that said, Simpson-Bowles is going to make you work for 2 more years. It was dishonest of them, and it was inappropriate. The simple fact is that adjusting the age of retirement makes sense under Social Security. Why? Because when Social Security was put in place, the average life expectancy of a male in the United States was 64. The average life expectancy of a male in the United States today, it's 82. Of a female, it was, I believe, 67, and today it's 90. The simple fact is our population is able to live longer and actually engage in work productive activity longer. And Social Security should recognize that in an extended way so that people have time to plan for it. So if you're under age 15, you can think about the fact you might have to work for 2 more years. The other 2 changes we made, something called changing the bend points, which essentially means more means testing. Higher income people get lower Social Security. You know, that's only fair in my opinion. Second, the third change was something called adjusting the COLA to a more accurate COLA cost. You wouldn't even notice it because there's basically no COLA increase today because inflation is 0. But over time, it has a very high multiplier effect, and it would be a more accurate COLA calculation. So that was done totally independent of the issue of addressing the deficit. We didn't use any savings, changes, adjustments in Social Security for the purposes of addressing debt or deficit. We used it simply for the purposes of establishing the integrity of the Social Security system. So it's very easy to do, but the politics of it are virtually impossible. Why? Because there are a lot of folks who get elected in this country today by demagoguing the issue of Social Security, and there are even more interest groups who get their income by using it as a source of revenue by scaring folks. And it's an unfortunate fact of our system, and, but it's the way it is.
So optimism and fear. Let me start with optimism. Although I did serve on the, I always hope this, you left, Elizabeth, the one thing you left off my resume is I did serve on the Senate Intelligence Committee for 10 years, and I always hope that wasn't an oxymoron, you know, that I guess I'll let all of you be the judge of that. In any event, in the intelligence world, you're dealing with death and terrorism and all that kind of stuff 24/7. So in the intelligence world, the saying is the definition of an optimist is someone who doesn't have all the facts. So, but in this case, I think we do have legitimate reason to be optimistic. And that was one of the first questions, right, Bob? A new child is going to be born. And look, I think that the best thing I can point to is history. We've always risen to the occasion. Whether it was the founding of the country or a civil war or a Great Depression or 2 world wars, all the different things that America has had to overcome. I mean, in previous chapters of political dysfunction, you read your history, we've had some pretty rough chapters we've had to go through, but we've always found a way. And so we're going through another one of those tough periods now. I believe we will find a way, but it's not going to happen by accident. And I don't think it's going to happen by people, you know, who are disingenuous with the American public and say, it would be easy. It would be easy to come here and say, sure, there's more than enough money to go around. We can cut your taxes and we can increase your benefits and we don't have to borrow money. And isn't that great? But that would be dishonest. And so if we are willing to assess the truth and act upon the truth, I think we've got every reason to be optimistic about the future of our country. I've got 2 19-year-old boys. I wouldn't choose for them to live anywhere else on earth but right here in the United States of America. And so I am an optimist about our future, even though we're going through tough times. Now, the thing about fear, I kind of agree with Judd on that. The thing about Social Security, now, I may get the year wrong, but you know, there are no Social Security accounts. There's not some account with money building up in it in each of our names that they take our payroll taxes out every month and put it in there. It's basically an IOU. And so the government cashes in those IOU, or individuals cash in those IOUs as they retire, and more people are starting to retire. And I think here at some point in the next few years, we get to the point where if you look at the money that's coming in from the payroll taxes we're going to keep paying to the amount that's going out, it doesn't go away. It doesn't go down to 0. That's not true. It's about 70%. The amount of money coming in is enough to cover 70% of the Social Security payments that we are responsible for going out to the baby boomers who are retiring. So it's a 30% problem that we got to deal with. But it is a gap. And if you don't deal with it, the money's got to come from someplace. You either have to borrow it, which is what we're doing right now. You take it from other parts of the budget, as I mentioned, like education and healthcare and everything else we want to do. You can take it from there. You can raise taxes. That's another way you can do it. Or you can have the Federal Reserve just print a whole lot of money, and the value of our currency would go down the tubes because we basically have hyperinflation going on. That's basically, it's a mathematical challenge. That's what it is. It's a mathematical challenge, and I am just incapable of coming to you and saying something other than 2 + 2 = 4. There may be people who attempt to do that, but I think we've got to see what the facts are. Don't be fear-mongering. Don't be, panicking about it, but be honest about it, and then make prudent decisions. If we act today, as Judd mentioned, they will be relatively modest in their effects going forward. If we wait, then some fear could be in order because the decisions will be so much more difficult.
Let's shift the focus a little bit to the defense budget. We've had some questions about that. What are the specific challenges for our defense budget? Are there, and let me just add to the context is that there's a process in place now, some budgetary caps that are written out for the next several years that are quite strict. And then one of the things that's going on in Congress right now is whether those caps can be overridden or avoided by adding something to a category that is not covered by the caps. And thus it's allowing the defense spending to go up without it covering the caps. But aside from that gimmick, the caps are quite tight, and there's one of the big debates going on right now is whether they're too tight. That's one question. And the second, but another question really is how should we be thinking of our strategy for national defense? Are there savings to be made there? Should the defense budget be reoriented as we're talking about reorienting some of these benefit programs?
As an armed services personnel.
Yeah, but I wasn't an appropriator. You know, well, herein lies the challenge. So when the sequester was put in place, basically Congress threw up its hands and said, this is too hard. We can't make distinctions in different kinds of spending. We're just going to cut it across the board, the same percentage for everything. And the same thing for the Defense Department budget. And so part of this depends upon a couple of big factors. Number one, how much instability there is in the world. What are the threats that exist to the national security of the United States of America? When you look at what's going on presently in the Middle East, there's some cause for concern. When you look at how Vladimir Putin is behaving in Russia, there's some cause for concern. China is becoming more assertive. Hopefully that will be in a responsible, benign way. But its neighbors are getting to be pretty concerned out there. We actually have a leader. You know, we're all focused on Iran right now and whether they're going to become a nuclear power or not. We can talk about that if you're interested in. But there is already a country that has probably 15 to 20 nuclear warheads, and a leader who last year held up a map showing the trajectory of missiles from his country hitting the west coast of the United States. That's Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Now, thankfully, he doesn't have missiles capable of doing that. But at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, they will succeed in miniaturizing those warheads and developing ballistic missiles that are capable of hitting our country. And this is a guy who is actually saying that he's willing to use nuclear weapons to hit our country. And he's a lot more unstable than the leaders of the former Soviet Union back in the day when we kind of had a Cold War with them. This guy's just very hard to predict. So it is a dangerous world. And the fact that we are the strongest, wealthiest country, and we unfortunately have allies in Europe and Japan whose economies are sick and frankly have some history there that has led them to not spend as much in the military. And there's a real free rider problem going on. They're counting on the United States to kind of deal with a lot of this, and that's not right. We need to try and get them to up their defense spending. But in Europe, it's going the other way because they're even deeper into debt than we are, a lot of them. So it remains a dangerous world, unfortunately. And we are still looked to take the lead in dealing with some of these challenges. And there are some legacy costs in the Defense Department budget, some weapon systems and that sort of thing that are outdated, need to be trimmed back and so forth. The challenge you've got there is that the most rapidly growing part of the defense budget are healthcare expenditures. Folks, men and women who've come back from Afghanistan, who've come back from Iraq, many of them have suffered injuries. Some of them have long-term challenges with traumatic brain injuries and things like that. There are efficiencies that can be made in the healthcare system for the Defense Department, but I really don't think that's an area most Americans should or will look at to cut spending. And so that's just a big part of the Defense Department budget. So if you take all the savings from what's left over, you really are getting away from just fat and getting into the muscle and sinew of our ability to defend ourselves, and would really limit our ability to address challenges that exist today and are surely going to arise tomorrow in the world in which we live.
Yeah, I would just put it in that's an excellent explanation of the defense issue. But to try to put it in a 30,000-foot context, discretionary spending is not our problem. It's not our In the last 2 years, 4 years under the sequester, we've saved about $2 trillion in discretionary spending. It's been held flat. Defense has been held flat. It is likely and probably necessary that defense spending be increased considering the seriousness of the threats around the world, and especially in the intelligence areas, which is where our primary line of defense is now, our ability to gather intelligence about people who want to do us harm. Regrettably, there's a huge number of people out there who want to do us harm. But that's not going to impact, that increase is not going to substantively impact our debt and deficit question. Our debt and deficit question is almost entirely driven by the 60% of the budget, which is not discretionary, actually 70%, if you throw interest in on top of it. And it's almost all healthcare, all healthcare. So that's where the money is. As you know, Willie Sutton was asked why he robbed banks. He said, that's where the money is. Well, if you want to fix the deficit and debt issue, you've got to go where the money is, and the money is in the health account.
Can I just add just one quick point, and it gets back to the individuals having the new child or grandchild and reason for optimism and so forth. If we can come up with a strategy to grow our economy and to give individuals the skills they need to get good wages in a competitive economy, there's reason to be optimistic, and it has an additional benefit of helping the debt and deficit situation, because to the extent more people are working, wages are rising, we have more exports from our country, we're selling abroad, that brings in more revenue to the Treasury. So that's not going to solve all of our problem. That would be wishful thinking. But I do think a thoughtful strategy in this area of a globalized economy, how do we grow our economy, how do we raise wages and standards of living, that's got to be a part of this debate too. And if we get that right, then I think that's a big reason for optimism all the way around, including it would be very helpful to solving our fiscal problems. If you can just get growth up even marginally and you compound it out over 10, 15, 20 years, it doesn't solve the whole problem, but it makes a material contribution.
Well, I want to segue off those two answers to get into perhaps the two thorniest issues. Social Security is very, and defense both get a lot of controversy, people arguing with definite opinions. But when you do look at the federal budget, it's health care, as Senator Gregg mentioned, and tax policy, which can have an effect on growth that Senator Bayh mentioned. So let's get into those areas. On health care specifically, Senator Gregg, I know you've done a lot of work in this area and worked with folks at Dartmouth on some strategies for controlling costs. And of course, part of the cost for the federal budget is just the demographics. People are getting older. There are more people, many more people receiving benefits for both Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid. But another part of that is just the fact that healthcare costs tend to grow faster than the economy. And that's been one of the great conundrums of how can we tend to spend more than any other country per person on health care, and that's one reason why the projections have looked as bad as they are. There's been some recent good news, but Senator Gregg, could you try to crack the code a bit on controlling health care costs?
Well, I'm happy to get into the weeds on that, but I do want to stress that the first budget initiative is not asking these national candidates to get into the weeds. Because if you do that, what was the term you used?
Drink hemlock.
Drink hemlock. You're not going to ask somebody running for president to give you the specifics on how they're going to do this, because that, in the context of the way our political system works, immediately means they would be attacked from whatever interest groups, of which there would be numerous, in a way that would be aggressive and over the top and probably unrepresentative. So what we're really asking with first budget is to be willing to acknowledge that the number one issue is the deficit, or one of their top issues is the deficit and debt. Number two, that they will put together a budget which addresses it for their first budget. And number three, that it'll be bipartisan. In the area of health care, first off, health care is such a complex matrix, there is no simple solution, there's no magic wand. Social Security, there are only 4 or 5 moving parts, you know what they are, you can pull the levers and you can fix it. Healthcare is not like that. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing, constantly being reinvented and improved. And so But if you want to talk about thematically how you get healthcare under control, there are two basic things which thematically bring it under control in the way that is constructive. What we want is higher quality in healthcare at a lower cost. Now you say that's counterproductive, counterintuitive. You can't get higher quality if you have lower cost. Actually, you can. You can do exactly that. And in fact, the Dartmouth Institute, which is the leading center of study of historical costs of healthcare and outcomes, has proven it beyond a doubt by studying across the country for years different procedures in different parts of the country. And this will be just an arbitrary and hypothetical example, but they will have shown that a knee replacement in Miami will cost 5 times what a knee replacement in Minnesota will cost, but the outcome in Miami will be worse than the outcome in Minnesota. And there's all sorts of specific procedures where they've gone through these studies. How do you get that to work? How do you get a higher quality with lower cost outcome? Two basic things. First, you incentivize systems to improve quality through something called capitation or accountable health care organizations, where basically you say to the health providers, you're going to get so much to do so much, and you're going to be expected to do so much with so much. And it works. It works. It actually works. And secondly, you engage the patient. You engage the patient so you don't have first dollar coverage, so you don't have overutilization. And so the patient's thinking a little bit. Most patients don't think very much when they get sick about costs, but they're thinking a little bit about discretionary healthcare activity in the context of what it's going to cost them. And if you do those two things, if you incentivize quality outcomes at lower cost through different systems, and their systems aren't monolithic. Various healthcare systems are going to come up with various systems. The key is to make sure that they're incentivized to do that. And at the same time, you incentivize the patient to be involved in their treatment through shared decision making and other actions. Then you're going to get, hopefully, over a long run, it won't be immediate, but over a long run, very, very scorable improvements in not only quality, but in costs. And it's been shown to happen. It's been shown to happen. So that's 50,000 feet. You can get down in the specifics, but that's the 50,000 feet solution, or response, not solution.
Senator Bayh, what's the 50,000-foot solution on tax reform?
Well, my friend has been involved in the details of that a lot more than I have, but I think in general, if you look at it conceptually, the construct would be there are a lot of exemptions and deductions and all sorts of preferences in the tax code today that are there because someone wanted them. And it kind of, what the economists would tell you is it distorts how the incentives people have and the kind of activity, economic activity that's going on in the country. So what you do, and this was last done in what, 1986, Judd? Yeah. So what you do is you get tax rates down for everybody, individuals, businesses. You get the tax rates down by eliminating a lot of these deductions and exemptions. And that way people, the money, the capital is allocated more efficiently. The economy grows. All the economists who've looked at this have said, yeah, the economy will grow a little bit more because of that. And that little bit more then brings in more money to the Treasury. And suddenly you've got a chunk of money there, several $100 billion over 10 years that you can use to either lower rates even more, or you can use it to reduce the debt and the deficit. And so that really is sort of at a 50,000-foot level, Bob, what would be going on. A simpler tax code with lower rates, but fewer items in there, which would lead to somewhat more rapid economic growth, which leads more money to come in, which then helps us pay down the debt and narrow the deficit.
And I think it's important to note that that proposal, which was essentially the Simpson-Bowles proposal, which is morphed into a variety of other proposals, maintains progressivity, which is very important to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and to myself. But basically, under our tax laws, 85% of the taxes, income tax, is paid by the top 20% of people with income. And you can do the same thing at a tax rate of a top rate of 23%, or a top rate of 42%, get the same progressivity. But what you get with a 23% tax rate is that people actually start to invest for return as versus for tax avoidance.
And just one final point. So the standoff in Washington has been, there are some people on the far right who say, well, if this was going to generate more money for the Treasury, none of it should go to the government. to abide by our no new taxes pledge. All of it has to go to even lower marginal tax rates. That's kind of their absolutist position. And on the other side, you'd have people say, well, if more money's coming into the Treasury, then we ought to use it not to pay down the debt, but for more, investment and spending on a variety of worthy things. And the compromise ground is probably somewhere in the middle. You have somewhat lower marginal tax rates, but you take a chunk of it to get the deficit and the debt under control. To me, it's sort of a no-brainer because the alternatives are, you either raise taxes, you cut spending, or you borrow. And if you can, by reforming the tax code, generate a good chunk of money to solve our debt problem, well, that's a good thing to do.
Okay, I want to get out of the policy weeds and get into a little bit of the engagement weeds, public engagement. And there's a question here. I'm going to read it because it's really a very important one and one that First Budget is focused on. How would you approach educating and engaging teenagers in a conversation about fixing the debt? The millennial generation, through a challenging and changing economy and expanding cost of higher education, are facing lower standards of living than many of their parents did. Beyond advocating for budget reforms, how would you recommend they take action to improve economic conditions for their working and retirement years ahead? So there's kind of an engagement question and a long-range planning question.
I've got twin 19-year-old boys. They're fraternal. They're very different. I got each one of them a credit card. There's a cap on it. I get to see the bills. And one of them, he doesn't spend anything. The other one, I've had to talk about debt and deficit spending with him. He's got an internship at the federal government this summer. He's going to fit right in some of those places. But in any event, the one boy is, he's an economics major, and he's the non-spender. I've actually talked to him about this, and and there's this a group out there called Kick the Can, which is young. Oh, I'm sorry, the Can Kicks Back, which is we're kicking the can down the road here, right? Leaving for that, and they're trying to do exactly what your question asks, which is they're trying to raise awareness among their peers about what it is they're going to inherit if nothing is done. And so I think just broaching the subject, I don't know about the rest of you, but normal teenagers and young 20-somethings don't normally think in these terms, but they ought to. For example, if they were taking out $200,000 of student loans, and that's a real problem for many middle-class families these days, they'd focus on that like a laser. But we're essentially putting a $200,000 debt burden on each and every one of them because that's the size of the deficit on a pro rata basis that every one of these kids is going to get. So I found, Bob, that just by raising the topic, and then immediately I told my son, I said, well, buddy, we're going to live high off the hog here, and we're grateful to you for paying for it all. I didn't say high off the hog. I just said we're going to have this deficit. We're counting on you to pay it off. He kind of didn't think that was such a great deal. So I think just by raising the topic and having a kind of a discussion with them about it, you can actually succeed in getting through. And hopefully more young people will get politically involved because by definition it is their future.
Well, I'll give you I'll answer the question myself too, and give a little plug for the First Budget Initiative, because that's really one of the things that we hope to do is get younger people involved in this issue, because as Senator Bayh said, they have the most at stake. And as folks came in, you may have noticed a volunteer card in case anybody, and you don't have to be a young person to volunteer to help with the effort. So if anybody wants to get involved with this effort, you can fill out a volunteer card. And also, one of the things that we plan to do and have been doing at colleges and universities around the state is do a budget exercise where people come in and they learn about the federal budget by trying to come up with their own plan. And they make choices from a range of options that have been scored by the Congressional Budget Office, so they're the same choices that Congress is grappling with. And it's a great way to learn about these issues and also to learn about making trade-offs with people who might have different priorities than yours. Some may want higher taxes, some may want lower spending than you do, and so people learn to make trade-offs. And so, part of the First Budget Initiative, aside from interacting with candidates, is to do this sort of educational effort with the public and with a particular focus on younger people. So let me ask for persistence sake, there's about 7 cards with the same question, so I'll just read it. What specific reforms do we need in order to advance to end the corrupting influence of money in politics? In a nutshell.
I'll be interested in Evan's answer on this because he came from a big state where it was very expensive to run. But even New Hampshire's gotten a very expensive place to run. I never spent more than $1.5 million on a campaign. I only did that once. So I was fortunate to be from New Hampshire. But in the last Senate race here, it was estimated that tens of millions of dollars were spent. And it's really unfortunate, and it's bad. It's very bad. The effect of these super PACs is really become disproportionate. As a candidate, you want to control your message. I mean, you've got a theme you want to talk about. You want to make your case. You want to lay out why you think you'd be good representative of the folks you're running to represent. But these super PACs can come in and they can claim they're on your side and they can dominate your message because they can spend 10 times what you can spend. And it's really, really difficult situation, this explosion of money in our political process. But I don't have an answer to how you fix it, because the Supreme Court was right in the United
Citizens United.
Citizens United case. They said that money equates with freedom of speech, because in our society, if you can't deliver your speech, then you don't have the freedom of speech. And I think they're correct that if you limit the ability of a person to speak by limiting their resources to deliver their speech, then you've actually limited the freedom of speech. So I have not seen a proposal that makes sense. You know, some people say, well, use public funding. Well, that was tried, and it really failed badly. The last presidential campaign certainly proved that. But more importantly, as a conservative, I quite honestly don't want my tax dollars funding somebody who I disagree with on the left. And I suspect Elizabeth Warren wouldn't want her tax dollars funding me where I'm running. So as a very practical matter, well, maybe she would, I don't know. I'm speaking out of turn there. But as a practical matter, I don't think public funding resolves the problem. And I don't have an answer. Now, I'm looking to Evan for an answer, so I'm turning this over to Evan.
Well, you know, Bob, I've really enjoyed this. I'm sorry our time is about up. Well, look, it really is a problem. And, you know, just so all of you know, in my 12 years in the Senate, I never saw, you know, someone actually bought off. I mean, just out-and-out corruption. I suppose it may take place in some quarters, but I personally never saw it. But it is corrupting. And it does, here's the pernicious effect that it has in my mind. The people aren't bought off, but what it really does is it makes members really afraid to compromise in any meaningful way whatsoever, because they know that if they violate party orthodoxy, even one little bit, there will suddenly be tens of millions of dollars in negative ads flooding into their state, you know, just trashing them. And so they're sitting there going, God, I kind of know this is the right thing to do, but I don't know if it's going to end up getting, you know, passed anyway. And if I do this, I'm just going to be eviscerated. And I'll give you an example. In my home state, Richard Lugar had served as a senator from Indiana for 36 years, six terms. He was so popular that my party decided to run no one against him for his 6th term. We thought this is just hopeless. We may as well spend our time and money doing something else. The next time, this would have been 2012, Dick Lugar did not vote for the Affordable Care Act. He did not vote for the stimulus bill. He did not vote for Dodd-Frank, the Financial Institution Reorganization Act. He didn't vote for any of that stuff. But apparently had done some things that had offended some people who thought he should have been just purely down the line. And so he was challenged in the Republican Party primary. Why do I tell this story? Normally it wouldn't have mattered. But you had 2 or 3 of these super PACs that Judd alluded to who came in and spent $6, $7, $8 million just with a deluge of negative ads on Richard Lugar, convincing, combined with the fact that only 16%, and this is a high-profile election. Everybody knew there was a primary going on. 16% of eligible Republicans voted, fewer than 1 in 5. And so very low voter, and that's higher than normal, but the fact that people don't normally vote in primaries in most of the country, and this huge amount of money coming in, he lost the Republican primary by 18%. Now, why do I tell that story to you? The other members looked at this, and they saw the flood of money coming in, and they go, oh my God, if I compromise with the other side on anything, that may happen to me. So it is not that it's corruption, it's that it leads to just a huge disincentive for any kind of compromise, even on small things. And so that's the contribution that it really makes to gridlock. I'm not enough of a constitutional scholar to know if the Citizens United case was decided rightly or wrongly, but I do think in terms of what do you do about it, if we had a different Supreme Court that had a different take on the Constitution, you might get a different result. The Supreme Court has been known to change its mind on some issues in the past, so that's one thing. If you had a presidential candidate who said they were, dedicated to doing something about this and might appoint people who felt similarly, a different take on the Constitution, that might be one way. You're never going to enact a constitutional amendment. That's just not going to happen. So to the extent that there's any good news in that what is a very sorry set of circumstances, it would be this. At some point, you reach the law of diminishing returns. And by that I mean, after you've seen the 1,000th negative ad, does it really make any difference if you see 5 or 10 more? Probably not. So I mean, at some point there's just so much money on both sides sloshing around the system, it just kind of negates itself out, and it doesn't have quite as big an impact. That's number one. And number two, there are a couple of encouraging signs in the use of technology in the internet, where some candidates who really get a following can raise a significant amount of money, $25, $50, $100 at a time, from loads and loads of people. And that kind of democratizes the campaign finance system and makes the big checks and the super PACs, not quite so important. So those are, two somewhat more positive things, but it is, I got to tell you, it's just a really bad thing in our political system right now. And that's a shame.
Let's end on a higher note and on a more optimistic note. This is the jury, and if you're giving the charge to the jury here of the folks that are, let's presume everybody will take a volunteer card and go out and meet with presidential candidates when they're coming through. I take from what we've had that we all agree that there's still a problem, an unsustainable debt problem, but it's not so big that it can't be solved. There are solutions that can be done, and it will take an element of bipartisan cooperation to do that. But what, as a prominent Republican and prominent Democrat, would you advise our volunteers to be pressing for?
Well, as I said, you're the most important people in the country. You have a chance to see these people, and you have a chance to see them early on, and the national press will all be here. And what we're really hoping for is that this will just be a part of the dialogue, and that you insist upon some level of candor from the candidates. And so, ask them, do you think the future debt projections and the current deficit level is concerning? Do you intend to impart, not the only thing, maybe not even the most important thing, but do you intend to try and address that in some way early on in your administration? Will you work with the other party in your first budget to begin to take the first steps toward doing something about that? And most of all, will you be honest with us and tell us, where is the money going to come from to do all the things we want to do as a country? How are we going to make this add up so that we don't just leave it for our children? Ask them that. And the press will be there to cover it. And, sure, there'll be some bobbing and weaving going on and that kind of thing. That happens in politics. But at the end of the day, you'll figure out, and the American people will figure out, who really means what they say, who's being more candid than not, and who at the end of the day can we really trust to balance this priority with all the others in a way that will answer the first question we got, and that is give us optimism and hope for an even better America, which we can have with the right kind of leadership. And all of you can play a very important role in making that happen. And I think you'd be amazed just by asking the question, standing up and just asking the question. If that happens several times, it's going to make an impact on their thinking. It will. It really will.
I agree 100% with that. And remember that one of the common grounding pieces or essences of New Hampshire is our common sense. And so just bring common sense to these meetings. And the question is pretty simple. It's a question of common sense. Do you recognize and believe that the deficit and the debt is a major issue confronting our nation and our children's future? If you do believe that, will you offer a budget as your first budget that puts out solutions to that question? And thirdly, will it be bipartisan? Because most of these issues can only be handled in a bipartisan way. Ask those questions of these folks who are going to come and see us. We are very fortunate to be the first primary state. It's a unique opportunity for us, but it's really a responsibility. We all recognize that as a state. It's a huge responsibility. It's the only place this happens. You know, Iowa's a great state, but Iowa picks corn and we pick presidents. And
Hold on now, Judd. Corn is pretty important.
We will
got a lot of that in
delete
Indiana.
from the first budget website. So.
But our opportunity is a responsibility too. Our opportunity is a responsibility to ask these questions of these folks who want to be the next president. You know, I admire anybody who's willing to run for president. It's just an incredibly difficult task. But they should still be asked to answer questions just from regular folks. And New Hampshire's where that happens. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks.